All right, everybody. Can you hear me? Right. Hello and welcome, everybody. It's amazing to see so many familiar faces. And yeah, it's my really huge pleasure to introduce you all today to the event of Conservation Conversations, where we have invited a number of speakers from both the aquatic science or facts or ACER programs and from conservation to give us a bit of an overview of their career paths and also a bit of an outlook, kind of where we are heading potentially into the future. And obviously it's also a great opportunity to mix and mingle and catch up with each other and yeah, get to contact also across the different generations of conservation and aquatic science ACER Facts graduates. So I'm really, really pleased that so many of you couldn't make it today. The weather was not very kind to us, so I was getting a bit worried, but yeah, it's great to see you all and catch up. And with that, I'll hand over to Carl.
I'm not going to know what I'm going to say, I've not planned anything, but anyway, just thank you so much for coming. We want to have a little celebration because we've been running these two courses which now link very well, the aquatic course, which has all sorts of names, and the conservation course for a long time, 73 years for the conservation course and 20 years for the aquatic course. And that's despite lots of university cuts, lots of pressure to pressure to amalgamate, closing. We've managed to keep these programs going. We've had low numbers, high numbers, but I'm just very proud that we've kept that moving. And I think that the reason for success really is we've had a very traditional approach of teaching people about practical conservation issues and conservation and restoration sort of in the field, and then with lots of field work. And I suppose lots of the things you will remember is some of the crazy field courses you've been on, the silly things that happened on those field courses. And they're things that you can all talk about in different years and always remember. So this is all about you lot really. We're not going to say anymore. It's going to be convened by current students, and we've also got a representation of the UCL Conservation, Nature and Conservation Society, which came out of these courses as well to a large extent. Here, so we'll shut up now and pass it over to you, and in particular to Rafe, who's a co-organiser.
Thank you very much, Carl and Jan. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. That was a very good introduction by Carl and Jan, so I think they really sort of hit the nail on the head. So yeah, it's lovely to see you all here in joining the celebration of these courses that have been very long-standing, as Carl has just mentioned. And so I'm Rafe. I'm a current conservation master's student, and I was very delighted that Professors Carl Sayer and Jan Aschmacher invited me to help them in creating this event today, along with PhD student Lily and Treasurer of the Nature and Conservation Society, Sally. You'll also see that there are two camera operators here, which are Molly and Sam from, I hope I get this right, the Ethnographic Documentary Filmmaking Masters. And they're helping us document this event because, as you've gathered from being such a long-standing course, there are many alumni who haven't been able to make it here today, so we want to create a film to put up on the website so everyone can catch up in their own time. To that end, if there is anyone who would not like to be filmed or not like to feature, please do come and find me or one of the camera operators in one of the breaks and let us know, and we'll make sure that you're not featured in any published material, so don't worry about that. So, in the spirit of today, being a current student, I just wanted to share a little bit about my experience over the past year being here at UCL, and see how that's sort of tied into my previous experience, which has been very much practical and in the field. So yeah, so I basically, when I graduated, I think I graduated. I didn't graduate. A little bit stuck. Okay, great. Thank you, Jan. Technical support. So when I graduated, I actually founded an organization with this lady Hayati in Malaysia. And so we basically met through some serendipitous encounters, and after spending some time on her land that she wanted to use for conservation rather than building a hotel or anything like that, we basically found that we were actually very aligned in what we wanted to do and what we wanted to create in terms of a model that was self-financing for conservation. And so we started this organization. So as you would imagine, from then until now, I've gained quite a lot of practical experience in the field and a lot of managerial experience along with that. But there was always this kind of feeling that I wanted to get a better academic grounding in conservation. And so that was really always niggling away at me, and I just never had the time to do a master's. So one fortuitous thing that's come out of the pandemic for me was to actually be able to come back and enroll. And I found this course at UCL and saw that actually all the modules were really kind of relevant to what I'd been learning in the field as I've gone along practically. So it's been a brilliant experience, and I just wanted to explain in a couple of minutes a few of the key points that I found most importantly linked to what I've done in the practical world, what I've learned here at UCL. So just to place that, just have a very, very short video from our volunteer program, just so you can see where we are. And of course, there's a lot more to the organization, and you can find out more on the website later if you want to, but just to give you an idea. So, coming back to the course, we kick-started our time in October with a field trip to Norfolk, which was absolutely brilliant. And I think that was a really kind of like great way to start the course, because not only were we out learning these essential skills in acquiring data and monitoring and all those essential sort of foundations, we also had a really brilliant experience bonding with everyone on the course. And as I've come to learn, the conservation world is actually quite small, so getting to know everyone is really a big part of it, and knowing who your future colleagues are probably going to be is really wonderful. So I was really glad that we had that to kickstart the course. Following that, we had a trip to Snowdonia, and that was a very different side of the conservation world. And that was really wonderful to see, because that was something that I felt lacked from my undergraduate degree, because we'd always learned about the term stakeholders, and it was always, okay, stakeholders, I'll write it down in my essay, my course, okay, stakeholders are ticked. And as obvious as it may seem, when you actually go out and are doing practical work, stakeholders are people, and they are individuals, and they have quirks, and they are not predictable, and they form parts of larger communities, and these communities are also unique. So I quickly learned from my time in Malaysia that what works on one island is actually not in any way viable on a neighboring island. And so that really taught me about having to have localized approaches to conservation initiatives. And I was very glad that in a marine conservation module, we taught how to look at all these different actors and bring them into a framework, so you could actually write it down in black and white and very easily digest and analyze what's going on in a particular area and see what areas need strengthening, which areas are too dominant. So that was really, really important. I look forward to taking that back to Malaysia and incorporating that into our work to see how we can make our work and the surrounding areas more effective. So basically, all those skills and many others that I don't have time to touch on now, I'm going to be taking to my work in the future. And as for the course itself as well, meeting so many people on this course that I know I've made lifetime friends, but also met future colleagues is a really great feeling. And I think that's something that the course is brilliant at doing, evidently seeing everyone here does very well. And I hope that the course continues to do these kinds of projects where we can sit and listen and hear from other alumni. And continues to evolve and stay as relevant as it is now. I'd like to invite our first speaker up here, Siguri from the Surrey Wildlife Trust.
Hi everyone. Thank you to Carl and Jan for firstly having me first, and secondly inviting me to come along and speak to you and share a little bit about what I've been up to. I wasn't entirely sure what to talk about, so hopefully what I'm talking about is useful and interesting to you guys. So I did the MSc Aquatic Science, as it was called then, back in, not sure, 2016, I think. And I did it part-time, so over 2 years, because I was working at the Wildlife Trust then alongside it, and then kind of continued to work with them after I graduated. So this is a little bit about what I've been doing since. So, oh yeah, I should have put that slide up when I was talking about that. But yeah, this is some photos of me. I did my undergraduate at UCL as well. Had a great time doing that. Looked at some ponds in my master's with Carl. And then, like I said, I've been working with the Wildlife Trust. So I started my journey with them in environmental education. So that's me in a badger outfit, dressed up as Charles Darwin and doing some pond dipping. So it's been great fun doing environmental education. But I wanted to use what I'd done in my master's a little bit more. So I've managed to kind of move internally, and the NGOs are really great with that, especially Wildlife Trust, into more GIS and research, and using a lot more of the skills that I gained during my master's. So in terms of what I do now, I've moved, like I said, into doing a bit more techie stuff, doing a bit more scientific research and things like that. So I have a really varied role, which is really fun, and I get to do a lot of what I want to. So I'm involved in our research prospectus, which is a program we send out to universities to get BSc and MSc students doing their dissertation projects with us. I get to do conferences like this one and talking about our work. Get to go and look at things in the field still, go do surveying and things like that. I get to do a bit of teaching, and I also do a lot of our kind of app development and survey technology, as well as modelling stuff on computers. So it's really, really varied and really, really fun. And a lot of my kind of focus of my work is the idea of evidence-based conservation. I think we feel as an organisation historically that conservation can be quite anecdotal, especially when you're working kind of with landowners and farmers and stakeholders. But we want to ensure that the decisions we're making in kind of real life are actually based on science and evidence, not just on kind of, well, we've always done it that way. So some examples of that are obviously biodiversity net gain, which is a really big topic at the moment. And one of the projects we're working on is where we could reintroduce some chalk grassland across the North Downs. So for those of you who don't know Surrey, we've got a really big ridge of chalk throughout our county called the North Downs, and it's got a lot of lovely chalk grassland on it. So as part of net gain offsetting, we want to offer some kind of nice sites to put more chalk grassland back in, and using connectivity modelling, which are those nice kind of diagrams down the bottom, we kind of model if we put in all of the chalk grassland we wanted to, how much more joined up would the North Downs be for the species that use those kind of habitats. So using evidence and sort of science and modelling to support decisions we were making on the ground. Another example of that is what we've done recently with the local county council, looking at green corridors through the urban areas of the county. So again, all of this will go into the kind of local planning policies and things like that. So it's been really great to be involved in that and help inform what then the local borough councils are actually going to do on the ground in terms of their urban green spaces. So the rest of what I was going to talk about is hopefully on theme in terms of what are the kind of conservation issues at the moment and then what might the future be like. So as you're probably all aware, these big four issues are kind of relevant probably to all of us, both in our jobs and in our personal lives. So obviously the ecological crisis, economic crisis, a bit rubbish at the moment, but then also alongside the climate crisis, there was sort of health and connection crisis. That's something as Wildlife Trust we think a lot about in terms of how people are becoming more disconnected with nature and how that can affect their health. So for us, as is the case in many places, it's not a good story at the moment. We did a recent report in 2018 and found that basically a third of our species are either extinct or under threat, and of the priority species, 37% are threatened or declining, and 31% are already extinct, which is not great. So David Attenborough, I don't know if you've all seen this show, had 5 suggestions for what you can do to combat these issues on a global scale. However, as someone who does not work on a global scale and works in quite a small local scale, what we try and do is take those kind of global messages and apply them to a local context. And I think that's the real strength of people like the British Trust and the Wildlife Trust who have all those kind of local branches, because they have that local knowledge and the local context of what they're doing. So how do we take kind of big global ideas that David Attenborough is talking about and apply them to what we actually have, which we don't have any coastline, obviously, but we have wetlands and rivers, we have chalk grasslands, heathlands, and obviously we have loads of ancient woodland as well, with lovely bluebells and things like that. So the first thing that David Attenborough suggests we should do is about reducing population growth and providing economic stability, raising people out of poverty. Obviously, as a Wildlife Trust, we cannot go around telling people to stop having babies, but what we do want to do is work with people who are already in our county and provide opportunities, empower young people to be more involved. As with many counties kind of adjacent to London, there's a huge pressure for development and population growth at the moment, so it's really key that we work with people. They are inherently connected to nature, and there's a great quote from David Attenborough that I always forget, but it's essentially along the lines of, if you don't know about it, you don't care about it, and if you don't care about it, you're not going to protect it. So we want to make sure that obviously people do know about it and therefore can care about it and protect it. But we also want to work with young people, because lots of research has been done to show that there's a big gap in terms of that you care about nature when you're young because you're like, yeah, bugs are cool. And then you care about it when you're an adult because you go for dog walks and other things and appreciate it there. But kind of while you're a teenager and a young adult, there's a big gap in people actually being engaged at all with the natural world. So we want to try and plug that gap, because obviously people of that age group at the moment are really crucial, because they will be the people signing up to this course in the coming years, but also going to be people making decisions and government and things like that. And then as a kind of also part of that, it's about making the sector more diverse, because the environmental sector is the second least diverse sector in the UK, which is pretty rubbish. There's a figure saying it's about 97% white, and there are figures for either kind of diversity groups, but I'm sure it's all similar. So we want to, again, provide opportunities to try and address those inequalities in the industry. Second thing that David Attenborough suggests we do is about phasing out fossil fuel use. And again, not something we can do a lot about as a small local charity, but we can reflect on our own practices and try and improve the climate in different ways. So we do a lot of internal reflection about right to work schemes and things like that. And I'm sure with many of you, as a result of the pandemic, there's a lot more working from home being done and hybrid working, which is great because it's obviously reducing everyone's travel time and carbon emissions. But then also a lot of the habitat management we're doing is relevant to carbon sequestration as well. So it used to be common practice that when work parties would go out and do scrub clearance, they would just burn it because actually all of the volunteers are pyromaniacs. But we realized that actually the kind of impact of that was really negating the work they were actually doing. So now instead of burning what they clear, we put it into scrub piles, which actually provides habitat as well. And then the other thing we're really keen about at the moment is hedgerows, which are more exciting than they sound. And they're a very, very important part of carbon sequestration and can sequester up to 50% more carbon than forestry, as well as linking up the landscape and providing lovely habitat and things like that. So we're really keen on hedgerows at the moment as well. Third thing is about protecting the oceans, reducing plastic. Again, very landlocked county, far away from the oceans, so we want to focus on our rivers and wetlands instead. Unfortunately, water voles and otters are functionally extinct in Surrey. Water voles especially have been gone for a very long time. We occasionally get an otter that might swim through, but it doesn't hang around very long. And obviously, as we're probably all familiar with from doing our course, that there's a massive trend in freshwater decline globally, and lots of local rivers just mirror that as well. So in terms of what we're trying to do to be involved in that, it's about doing river restoration projects, addressing catchment sources and working with catchment partnerships with rivers trusts and other organisations, and also trying as best we can to deal with invasive species as well. Things like obviously signal crayfish, and whether or not it's actually good news or not, a project I was doing this year was looking for demon shrimp in the Way, and we didn't actually manage to find any. So either the students doing it were not looking very hard, or they're not there anymore, which would be great. Fourth is about reducing the meat and eating more plant-based. Again, cannot go out into Surrey and tell people to start being vegetarian, but we can work in our own way with the agricultural sector. So we have cows, they're very cute, and they are part of our conservation grazing program. So it's something I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but the idea of instead of doing kind of traditional things like mowing or manual clearance, you can just leave the cows there basically and they do it for you. So they do a much better job than machinery can. They co-evolve with a lot of the things they're grazing on. So for example, we have some that graze our chalk grassland, and they preferentially will eat the grass basically, and they'll leave behind wildflowers that are needed as food plants for the different butterflies. They do eventually go into burgers, but they are obviously a much more sustainable source of meat than if you would just go to McDonald's or something like that. We also work with farmers and with agro-environment schemes and things like that, getting them to do better things on their land essentially. And with the upcoming Elm scheme, we want to really use that as an opportunity to make sure that farmers are taking the right actions on their land, and that they're not kind of dissuaded by all the bureaucracy and red tape around grants. And lastly, about halting deforestation and planting more trees. That's a really interesting one in our context, because Surrey is the most wooded county in England. So actually, we've already got loads of trees, and for us, it's about planting the right trees in the right places. Like I mentioned before, we have lots of lowland heathland and chalk grassland, which are both incredibly rare, valuable habitats in their own right. Chalk grassland is allegedly the European equivalent of a tropical rainforest, and lowland heathland obviously is an internationally protected habitat, and has lots of designations like Ramsar sites, SACs, SPAs, and things like that. Surrey is a really important stronghold for both of those habitats because of our geology and just our kind of local history. So although the county council has promised to plant like 2 million trees, we want to really ensure that that tree planting doesn't happen in either of these places, because it's really important to maintain these for their own biodiversity value and to ensure that it doesn't just become more woodland. So trees in the right places, but then also the right species of trees as well. So absolutely plant trees in gardens, plant trees in urban green spaces, but not on really important open habitats as well. So just some reflections before I wrap up about the future. As is my role in the trust, I would like to think that technology will be playing a really big role in the future of conservation. So lots of things I'm involved with, with GIS, drones, using digital survey forms. It's all massively increasing, thankfully, the efficiency of what people are doing. So increasing the efficiency for our consultants, for our project managers, using it in citizen science as well, is making it more accessible and much easier for people to collect data. So historically, our citizen science volunteers would go out, write some stuff down about the riverfly survey they'd done, and then they'd send us in a soggy, muddy piece of paper, which would then sit in a cupboard for a while until someone eventually put it on the system. So I think that this is going to play a big role in increasing the efficiency. And as I'm sure you're all aware, a kind of chronically underfunded sector, giving people more time to do things is going to be really valuable and hopefully mean that we get more stuff going on. And then that picture with the planes is obviously we're not doing anything with planes, but the idea around AI and machine learning coming into it. So there's going to be a really exciting project that we're going to be involved with about recognizing habitat using machine learning and AI from high-res satellite imagery. So again, technology hopefully playing a really exciting role. Nature-based solutions as well is a phrase I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So the idea that we need to work with people with different perspectives, economic perspectives, and show them how the biodiversity and the climate crisis are interlinked. And we need to make sure that if we're telling people, why don't you plant these trees here, or why don't you put a hedgerow in your field, they're seeing that not only as a biodiversity thing, they're seeing it as a climate change thing, but they're also seeing it how it can be economically beneficial to them as well. So I think it's really about, making people realise that everything is all integrated, it's all one system, they're not kind of separate spheres. So I think I'm sure Craig will probably mention later, the idea of a kind of wilder future and having a living landscape, as we've called it over the years, where people and nature live in harmony would be lovely. I'd like to think that we can get there one day, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room are going to play or are already playing a massive part in that. So yeah, hopefully finish on a positive note, but thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to catching up with some of you later in the day.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was really interesting, and certainly very interesting to hear how technology is going to be helping with the efficiency of citizen science as well as already. Next we have Anna McLaughlin, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, from the Royal Parks. Thank you.
Thank you, and hi, and thanks to Carl and Jan for asking me to come today. So, as I said, my name is Anna McLaughlin. I am currently the volunteer officer for Royal Parks, but I only have been for 3 months. So this is quite a new title for me, but we'll probably go into that a bit later. When Carl and Jan asked me to do this, they said, could you explain maybe how the MSc helped you and how it's progressed your career and things like that. But I'm actually going to indulge in once I can go back one step, which is that's me on the left. What you can't really see there is that I'm holding a bucket of bugs at Epping Forest, because every single year I ask my mum to take me to Epping Forest to the FSC there and go bug hunting. That's my friend Rosie. She's still my friend Rosie, and she still looks like that. The reason I'm explaining some of this is I'm not sure what your guys' journey to get to this room today is, but mine was definitely not straightforward. I wasn't that academic at school, and I certainly wasn't scientific, so the rapid version of all of this is my undergraduate is in illustration at Cambridge School of Art. I knew pretty quickly that I had absolutely no interest in being an artist for someone else, but that's just the way our strange sort of education system funneled you into it. So I ended up working fundraising at Tate Britain, which was wild. But that interestingly led me to get a job at London Wildlife Trust. So I again went to fundraising there. I was a fundraising assistant, and then I was an officer, and then I was a corporate officer, and then I was a business development officer. And I definitely knew that I was with the right people, but I thought I was doing slightly the wrong thing. And so they made me redundant, but at the same time I decided I think I wanted to go into sort of academia, or at least go back to university and probably start studying the right subject. And I went to a lot of university open days, and I said to them, I have a BA, that won't help me at all, but I promise I know what I'm talking about, I've done it for a long time. And pretty much every university said, no, you need a BSc, go away. And then I came to UCL's Conservation Open Day, and I spoke to Jan, and I said, please let me know. And he said, yeah, that's fine, come with us. So I did. And then on graduation, I got a job as a conservation ranger, and 3 months ago, changed job to be volunteer officer for the Royal Parks. The MSc. So the things that helped, I think, the most, the education side of it, yeah, totally, absolutely. But actually, I think my favourite things were all of the things that intermingled with everything that we did in the course. Field work, resilience, when you are utterly drenched in a lagoon in Dorset, or boiling hot in a Norfolk field dragging equipment about to the 17th pond. Or I think in that day it was -4 degrees at Hampstead Men's Pond. So it certainly gives you resilience. But sort of some of the other amazing job opportunities, Carl teaching you how to caress an eel, or Ben teaching you exactly what way you wiggle your fingers in Heathland Pond to attract medicinal leeches, or how you measure a crucial part, or probably the oddest one is how you resuscitate a trout that had been electrocuted. Species ID. Now this is sort of my public apology to Jan and Carl, because the only thing we were told to actually buy for our course was Rose's wildflower key, and as a broke student, £25.66 was really, really expensive, and I was really angry that we had to buy it. I was adamant that we wouldn't use it, the internet exists and all of that stuff. But I stand entirely corrected, because the Rose's wildflower key has not left my coffee table. It is haggard and bendy and covered in all sorts of stuff, but there's not a week I don't use it. And actually what the masters did for me, and what it kind of, I was pretty good at sort of fauna ID anyway, but it really made me love botany. I mean, that's just a medicinal leech, whilst I was trying to take botany notes, but on here. So. I think the most important thing, though, it did in terms of helping my career is the networking. Back in the day, we were just the UCL Conservation Group, and we were now the Nature and Conservation Society. But I think, as Ray said earlier, it's your future colleagues, and these people are my future colleagues because they are my current colleagues. The networking and collaborations, we've done bio-blitzes in Chagford and in Berkeley Square. The middle one, I think, was an arts engagement with UCL Engage. There was a massive arts pollution project that we did together, and then sort of getting the opportunity and kind of just having the goal of being students and going, Nick Baker, George McGavin, will you do us a talk? And then miraculously saying yes. And then there was just one tiny sprinkling of crisis management. I think to this day I'm the only person who called up Jan and cried and said, my thesis has been eaten by a kestrel, and it had. The entire term economy I was studying was munched. But crisis management, in his effervescent, calm style, Jan talked me through what to do next, and sure enough, there was an actual project at the end of the day. I became a conservation ranger for Redbridge. Full disclosure, I grew up in Redbridge. I still live in Redbridge. I'm incredibly biased towards East London. But all of these things are part of those jobs. To be honest, I think everyone who's speaking to you today is probably going to explain that every job has 17 different jobs sort of within it. But in Redbridge, we're really lucky. It has ancient woodlands, it has acid grassland, it has wildflower meadows, it has an amazing river that I'm really, really, again, biased about. It has reed beds, it has so many habitats. It's a fantastic opportunity, or it was, to be the conservation ranger. There was only 2 of us, so we were a tiny, tiny team with an awful lot of green space to manage. But again, there was a lot of partnership working. So it's created all of these partnerships. We've worked with 1021, we've worked with the Orchard Project, I've worked with ZSL, worked with Earthwatch. There are so many people, and again, as Greg said, it's a very sort of, you realise how small the world is, and I've ended up working with my with fellow students. Public engagement is quite a large part of what you do in any part of conservation. So I've led Redbridge youth groups to get them more engaged, be outside, public engagement walks, that's a bat walk, environmental education. I maintain kids are the funniest people to do anything within conservation. They ask absolutely the best questions. And then citizen science at the top. That's me working with Phoebe from ZSL on the Riverfly Partnership Initiative, so training people how to survey our local river, and at the bottom train people how to do butterfly transects as well. And the best part, I think, of conservation is the wildlife. Having such a varied job means that you pretty much have sort of carte blanche to have a grand old time. That sometimes means monitoring, it's supposed to be monitoring dormouse. We have no dormouse in British, but we do an awful lot of the yellow necked mites we discovered as part of that project. Asking members of the public to monitor stag beetles, reptile surveys, monitoring our bat boxes, camera traps, which were actually aimed at hedgehogs, but we managed to just capture all of our badgers. And also had the opportunity to get my Great Crested Newt license as well. As I say, that has now, the next step is, as of 3 months ago, I became one of the volunteer officers for the Royal Parks. This is a slide that's showing this plug on the slide, but rather than actually being the conservation ranger now, I am getting a whole army of volunteer rangers to come and sort of help me with all of this. The role I'm currently doing is to be the sort of coordinator for volunteering within the Range Park and Regent's Park. The rangers already exist in Richmond and Bushy, and they get involved in loads of stuff. A lot of it is still wildlife related, but a whole lot of it is engagement with visitors, and also there's a massive heritage component about the parks as well, which is new for me, but actually I find really, really interesting. That being said, there's still wildlife involved. So last week, we were monitoring the hedgehogs in Regent's Park. Regent's Park has the only central London hedgehog population that is quite drastically in decline. I think 9 years ago when they started monitoring, there were 30 plus. There are now 9. They're not going to be around for long, but the point is we have to manage them and see how they're doing. So that was about 3 a.m. It was tough, but it's lovely. And again, because of all of those networks, because of all of those sort of collaborations, next week, which is not part of my job, but I'm going to monitor the eel trap on the River Roding, and that is solely because of all of those partnerships and all of those people that I've met over the years who have said, yeah, come along, I'll be part of it. So the last thing that Jan and Carl asked us to sort of cover, which I think is impossible in a 15-minute presentation, but what is successful conservation? Honestly, I have absolutely no idea. That's not necessarily true, but potentially realistic. What I do think is true are these things, and I actually originally had, similarly to Ben, talked about kind of conservation on a local scale and the successes there, but actually, ultimately, they're the bigger questions that we need to answer. I think we need to be more proactive about. Some of you might recognise these are basically a variation on the United Nations sustainability pillars, but I think pretty much everyone would agree that these are actually absolutely basic for conservation success. Environmental sustainability, we have to be responsible, we have to have responsible interactions with the environment to avoid depletion. Social justice, we know that marginalised communities are infinitely worse off. They bear the brunt of the worst environmental problems, and more often than not, they don't have the resources to fight it. Economic stability. We need to ensure that people have jobs, they have clean water, they have somewhere to live, they have food security, and if you don't do any of that, then sort of all of it's in vain, ultimately. But the thread through all of my slides is people. People potentially got us into this, but it will absolutely be people that get us out there. And the best thing of the masters and my jobs before the masters and all sorts of things are people. I think we need to respect the authority of grassroots movements. I think at times we need, as conservationists, to step out of the echo chamber, this room potentially included, and examine where we're lacking, examine who's not here, who aren't we reaching, why aren't we reaching them, are we gatekeeping? But ultimately, I think anyone can be a conservationist, as long as you're passionate. formal training is not a prerequisite for it. And there's going to be a lot of time and it takes a lot of energy, but successful conservation is worth it, and I think there's a role for absolutely everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was really brilliant and very fun and witty as well at the same time. That's good. I like that a lot. Joining us now is Mel Sanders from the South East Rivers Trust.
Hi everyone, thanks to Jan and Carl for organising everyone else involved. I'm Mel and I did the aquatic science course in 2018. But before that I was always quite interested in the watery environment. I grew up near the upper reaches of the River Thames and spent a lot of time playing in chalk streams and watercress beds. It's very idyllic. Now I know what most rivers look like. But yeah, I was always really interested poking around, and that really kind of sparked my interest in the natural environment. So I went off to Aberystwyth University to do a degree in physical geography, and there again I was quite biased towards rivers, and did all the modules that had water in them, and then did my dissertation on a river restoration project in the Eden Valley in Cumbria, which is at those pictures there. So that was really interesting. I was using GIS map paleo channels to inform a river restoration project. So that was really my first kind of foray into the conservation delivery scene. And yeah, it's very inspiring. I met some interesting people. And then I went off to work in consultancy for a bit, and then I decided that I wanted to learn more about our freshwater habitats. So did a quick Google and found the aquatic science course. I thought it looked great. So yeah, I packed in my work and came to London and just had an absolute blast really, I think, like most of us who did the course. Saw some great critters and went on some great field trips and was just really inspired by everybody I met and the work that we did. So I think the biggest lesson I learned really from the course was just how much was going on around us. It really opened my eyes to all these different ecosystems and just what was going on and how everything was so linked. So I think the key message I learned from the course was connectivity and the importance of all these systems being connected. And that sparked my survey for my dissertation there, which was doing research into beavers in Scotland on the Tay system and how they affect aquatic terrestrial links. So I was up there catching emergent insects, pickling them, which I felt really bad about, and then just working out the difference between streams with beavers on and streams without beavers on, and obviously there were more insects where there were beavers, and then I looked at the birds as well. Yeah, so I just got to spend a few weeks in beaver land, which was really lovely. So after that I was definitely sold in a career in freshwater conservation. So I went to work for Staffordshire Wildlife Trust. I was very lucky when I started there. I picked up various projects, but one that was almost ready for delivery, which was this big river restoration project on the River Trent. So there I just got to kind of watch the diggers come in, point at various trees that should be chucked in, and I oversaw this really cool restoration project. So we were restoring this paleo channel, which is where the river used to run. It's reinstating this river island. So when we dug down, we found all the natural river gravels, which is amazing really. And because we were kind of re-digging this channel, we were able to put in lots of natural features. So lots of trees, lots of cobbles to make riffles, and lots of pools. So it made quite a nice habitat. And it was really cool to walk through the channel before the Trent had been unplugged. You can see, oh look, like there's a pool, but yeah, there was no water in it. So it was very interesting. And I was really lucky really to join at a time where I got to work on such big projects. I don't think I realised at the time how long it takes to get to delivery stage. And then from Staffordshire I moved down south. I now work with the South East Rivers Trust. So I work, it's a huge catchment, it's literally the South East, but I just work with mould mainly and the Cookmere, which is really nice because they're very different catchments. And I have quite a varied role, really, similar to Ben was saying earlier. I'm quite lucky, I get to do lots of different things. So one of the main things I do is work with stakeholders, and that's through catchment partnerships in the Marl and the Picmere. I work very closely with the Surrey Wildlife Trust, and they're just kind of a way to bring people together who have an interest in rivers and their catchments. We think about opportunities and issues and potential projects in our catchments, and kind of come up with ways to go around things. All disagree, but either way we get to talk about it. I do quite a lot of community engagement as well, so guided walks and guided talks, and I do a fair bit of data analysis as well with our GIS team. So things like using natural capital to look for opportunities within catchments, and also looking at where there are gaps in data as well that we might be able to fill with our projects, because all of our projects are data and science led. The kinds of projects that I work on now are to do with things like fish passage, so weirs, removing them or making them passable, habitat creation, anything to do with habitat really. Again, bringing in connectivity and trying to link habitats up. Increasingly working with landowners on land management techniques, so things like improving soil structure, reducing runoff, and different ways of farming, regenerative farming. And unfortunately, this involves a lot of walkovers, so you get to be outside quite a lot as well, which is nice. One of my favourite projects I worked on was to do with eels. So I think my first essay in organic science was about eels, and I just couldn't believe what they get up to. So when I was asked to work on this project, I was delighted. So it was a partnership project with different rivers trusts and ZSL in the Thames catchment. And it was basically raising awareness of the European eel to schools and to communities. So I got to do community talks and walks about eels, lecture people about eels, which was great. And we also did some elver migration monitoring as well. So we had an eel trap on the Mole where we had volunteers out counting and measuring how many elvers were working their way to the catchment. And some days were over 100, so they had to fish out each individual one and put it in a bag and measure it. So they were there for hours. I don't think they realised what they signed up to on some days. And then lastly, we had a new citizen science scheme called Obstacles, which is basically where volunteers went out and walked stretches of, well, in my catchment is the Mole, but other catchments in the Thames, and noted down where barriers were. As I mentioned earlier, we looked at data sets where there are gaps in the data, and the data set that we had of the barriers last year, we had about 55 on the Mole, and when our volunteers finished their surveys, they found 66 more barriers, so more than double what we had before. So this is really good data to have. It will help us prioritise projects in the future and barriers that we can make passable and try and connect the catchment up a little bit more. So I think from my career and my studies, learned quite a few lessons. But the biggest one I think is the collaborative working. I can't remember who it was earlier said that they heard the word stakeholder, but they didn't really know what it meant until they started working. Bringing people together and working on projects together, I think is a lot more successful than trying to go do things alone. I've had great successes in all the kind of partnership projects that we've worked on, and it's been really valuable. So I think that links in quite closely with knowledge sharing. The Thames Eels project is a really good example of this. We all worked in different catchments but doing similar things. We had lots of lessons that we learned and lots of data and information to share. And there's a lot of people in this sector. We've got a lot of expertise and a different background, so it's really nice to be able to share our knowledge at things like this event. Education has been mentioned a few times, but it's at the heart of many of our projects at the South East Rivers Trust. There's not much point in doing work without people sort of understanding it, and obviously we want to carry on doing it in the future. So that's a key lesson, and I think it's also really important to monitor our successes. It's not always possible to do monitoring, but I think so much of our work and projects come about from things like degradation of habitats or declines in species, and it's a bit depressing. So I think it's really important that we look at the success and the positive positives that we've made, and also that can help us to learn as well as we move on. And then lastly, I'd like to be patient, because realise quite quickly it can take quite a long time for projects to come to fruition, and sometimes it takes a long time for changes to be seen as well, especially when you're not actively working on something. You know, if you're just leaving a habitat to restore itself, you're not going to see changes overnight. So yeah, in the future, I'd like to see more funding. I know that's an obvious one, but it's important, and not just for direct project delivery. Things like catchment partnerships, they're really poorly resourced, and they are a great way for people to come together. So we definitely need more funding, and I think we do need more direct funding going into the environment. So, for example, you know, when water companies move rivers, they get prosecuted, big fines, but that money just disappears, goes into the treasury, it doesn't go back into our rivers. So I'd like to see more funding directly invested into our environment. I'm hopeful that the environmental land management schemes will kind of start a new era of how we manage our land. I think at the minute there's a lot of land that's being wasted. It's not profitable because it's always wet, but I'm hoping that with the new land schemes, farmers and landowners will receive compensation for that land, and that actually might become, you know, the most diverse bit passed along someone's estate or something like that. So I think it's really important that we look at land differently. And then I put collaborative landscape scale conservation as well. I think you've probably all heard about nature recovery networks and landscape scale nature recovery strategies. I think those will link really nicely with all the other schemes that are going on, and if we can all join up the projects that we're doing, then hopefully we'll see some nice changes. And then finally, my colleagues and I, we have this channel where we share pictures from walkovers. Some nights and some are less nice. But I'd like to see fewer pictures like this on our channel. So sewage fungus, see too much of that. Just general, I don't really want to know what that is. And then this picture at the end here was sort of frozen slurry that was directly discharging into a river, which we've affectionately named a poosicle. So I'd like to see fewer of those. I'd like to see less concrete channels and just concrete in general, this over-engineering and squeezing of rivers, fewer weirs, and those sandbags at the end that just makes something out of World War II. So yeah, I'd like to see less grey environments and more greener environments. I'd like to see floodplains and rivers connected. I'd like to see multi-channel rivers. I'd like to see habitats like wet woodland becoming more normal. Need more logs and rivers, and I'd like to see conservation incorporated into education more, for not just primary school age, but also secondary school as well. And finally, I'd like to see more of these. I'm going to get it to play. Oh. Yeah, I'd like to see more of these. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mel. That was great. Yeah, I agree with you. Fewer poosicles and yeah, those eels getting everywhere. It's great. Next we have Craig Bennett from the Wildlife Trusts.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to see you. And it's great to be back here at UCL in what I worked out just a few minutes ago, to my horror, is 27 years from when I did the MSc in Nature Conservation. So I was asked this afternoon to give a little bit of a sense of what's my life been, what's my career been after the MSc, and perhaps how it helped, and indeed, you know, some thoughts about the future. So that's what I'm going to try and offer you. And I have to say, it was fantastic to follow Ben and Anna and Mel. Really enjoyed those talks, and particularly Mel, that little footage of the beaver there as well. That's fantastic. So yes, I did my master's MSc in conservation across the road in the Department of Biology, as it was then, in 1994 to 1995. And we started, as I'm sure it sounds like it's still pretty much the case, with the field trips. A field trip up at the Isle of Rum in Scotland, and then one in the Lake District. And I'm going to give you three things that particularly stand out for stuff that I learned in that year. The first was on those field trips, both at the Isle of Rum and the Lake District. We had Brian Wood. Dr. Brian Wood was one of the tutors at the time. And he was the person to really open my eyes to the fact that pretty much most of the landscape we have in this country is not natural. And that particularly, I'd grown up thinking the Lake District was this lovely kind of place and, really proud about this lovely natural bit of Britain. And he opened my eyes to the fact that it's not really at all. And whatever you think about that debate, he got me to recognise that it's a choice. We have a choice as to whether we want the Lake District to look the way it does, or in fact you want it to be covered in trees through natural regeneration. And really, that's 27 years ago, we were talking essentially about what you now call the rewilding debate, without using those words at the time. And that really informed so much of my career since, in those debates that we had on the MSc back then. The second thing is we went on a group project to Guernsey, where we were hired, the whole course was hired, to produce the biodiversity strategy for Guernsey. Which I think was pretty much ignored by the states of Guernsey very soon afterwards as considered too radical, would you believe? I think if you looked at it now, you would not have thought it was radical. But one of the things I do remember from that was also how at one point it was myself and another colleague on the course, Debbie Banks, and she now works on tigers at the Environmental Investigation Agency. And we were invited to go and speak to the Rotary Club dinner in Guernsey. And we said some relatively gentle things about how it was we thought it was a bad idea the way in which one of the more important marshes there had been turned into a golf club. We hadn't really thought about the audience, or perhaps we had, I don't know. Most of the audience were members of that golf course, and they got very cross with us and tried to argue that actually the golf course was very good for nature because it was green. It had a few crows in it. And the big lesson for me from that is that sadly too many people equate green space as the same as nature. And that's something that has stuck with me for a lot of my career, actually. The final thing that was interesting is for my dissertation that year, I was incredibly lucky what I ended up doing. In January 1995, halfway through the course, just when I was thinking what do I do for the dissertation, this mad guy was presented to us, called Julian Matthews from the Discovery Expeditions. And he was presented to us, and he walked into the lab, and he said, I'm after 2 volunteers to come with me on an expedition to Mongolia. And we're wondering if a couple of you want to come and do your dissertation on that. And myself and Martin Harper, who's joining us later today, we were both on the course together. And our arms shot up. And to this day, I still don't understand why we were the only two who put our hands up immediately on that. But I mean, again, making me feel very old here. This was pretty much pre-internet. In fact, when I was doing my MSc here, the building opposite, the Darwin building, was the very first place I ever heard of this thing called the internet, and indeed saw it. And we were introduced to it on our MSc. And weirdly, one of the things we were asked to do is to download, I still don't understand this now, the health and safety, download the health and safety certificate or something from the Botanic Gardens in Sydney, Australia. I don't know why we had to do that anyway, but we did. And I think it was just showing what the internet might be like one day. And I sent my first email in that building over there as well, just saying how old I am really. But it was all very exciting. But what you couldn't do on the internet back then is actually get anything useful about what was happening in the world. And we tried to find out about this northern bit of Mongolia that we're going to before we went there, and we couldn't really find out very much at all. And so what we could piece together was what habitats were like across most of Mongolia, and so we planned our research according to that. And I was very interested in sort of studying marmots, which were present across lots of Mongolia, and had a few hypotheses about interesting things there. I got all very ready for it, including getting jabbed for rabies and things like that across the way. And when we got there, we discovered that the region of Mongolia we were in was much more like Switzerland. It wasn't a bit like what we thought. And indeed, there were no marmots there. And so we suddenly had to, in the middle of nowhere, come up with a new plan for dissertation. And certainly couldn't speak to any tutors back here in the process. So in the end, while I was speaking to local people, found out was that actually a lot of species were being poached for the illegal wildlife trade, particularly bear populations, musk deer and so on, because essentially the border with China had just opened up after the fall of the Soviet Union and so on just a few years before. And so that had sort of been like a vacuum cleaner turning on for species that were traded in the illegal wildlife trade. And so I studied that again, the wildlife trade and what was happening out there. So again, a big lesson in that, which I think is very relevant to anyone working in conservation, is whatever plans you have, be fully prepared that you end up doing something utterly different as well, that bears no resemblance to what you originally were planning to do. 3 good lessons that came from my Masters. When I finished the Masters, again I was across the way, just handing in a dissertation, finishing that off, and in New Scientist that week was an advert for volunteers for wildlife research projects at the Environmental Investigation Agency, which, if you don't know, is a small NGO that focuses on wildlife trade. And because I'd done my Masters on that, I applied for this volunteer position and immediately got it, and was thrilled to do so. And then a few months later got a job at EIA and worked on the wildlife trade for the first 3 years of my career, really. And that was a direct result of what I did on my Masters, so I'm very, very pleased about that. I have to say, I've heard others say here this morning, you know, my first job back at EIA was very varied. It was a very, very varied role. You did the research, you did the campaigning, you did the organising press conferences, everything, and the lobbying as well. And I would really recommend, if you have any choice about it, your first career, your first job in this career, good to get it really varied, because then you get a real sense of what it's all about. In 1999, I then went to Friends of the Earth as assistant wildlife campaigner. And I was very lucky to work at the time, be plunged straight into a big campaign for a new piece of environment legislation, the Countryside Rights Away Act, as it became. I followed that as it went through Parliament, which was a really fascinating thing to do. And I also campaigned to try and stop the cutting of peat bogs, and indeed to try and end the sale of peat in our garden centres. And I remember in 2001 being absolutely thrilled when we got a voluntary agreement with retailers to stop selling peat in 2011. Yes, there's a lesson there, isn't there? Because if you go down to retailers now, you still find it being sold there. They broke their promises. So perhaps a bit of lesson there about don't always trust voluntary agreements, I would say, as well. In 2003, I became senior campaigner there, ended up heading a team that was looking at corporate accountability and trade issues. And I suddenly found myself, you know, after having done this MSc in conservation, being plunged into the depths of company law, of trade deals, and indeed also looking at the things like the Climate Change Act, trying to get that to become law, all of which seemed quite distant from some of the things we'd learned on the course in some ways, and yet absolutely essential for driving the change that was necessary to deliver on the vision that was behind the course. In 2007, I went to the University of Cambridge and ended up becoming Deputy Director of what is now called the Institute of Sustainability and Leadership. And there I was really focused on climate issues. And this happened to certainly a lot of people that were on my course. We started off on biodiversity, and then through the mid-2000s found ourselves absolutely firmly working on the climate crisis as it sort of loomed in such a big way. But back then, it was seen as a very much separate issue. You had people either worked on climate or they worked on biodiversity. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. I came back to Friends of the Earth in 2010 as Director of Policy and Campaigns. One of the things that struck me at the time is Friends of the Earth was in a slightly odd place at the time. Lots of people were very miserable for some reason, and the campaigns were quite miserable. And actually, I think people become really worn out talking about just climate issues. And there was a lot of what you could call climate fatigue after the Copenhagen Climate Conference, which had been such an upset. And I felt passionately that what was missing was a bit of work on nature, both for the staff, for the volunteers, for activists, and just for the public at large. And there had actually been a big nature campaign in the UK for a long time at that stage. So I thought we've got to be able to talk about the importance of ecosystems and ecosystem services without using those phrases. And so we looked around, and it just so happened bees were strongly in decline, and so we launched a huge campaign on bees. And the campaign on bees that we launched at Friends of the Earth was almost like an ambassador for the bigger story about what was happening to nature. They were the perfect ambassador to convey that bigger story about the importance of nature and how we depend on it. And people could instantly relate to it. Having those ambassadors, having those tokens that tell those bigger stories was so important. And in my time at Friends of the Earth, then as director of campaigns, got campaigns going on clean air, on fracking. I became chief exec at Friends of the Earth in 2015. Had a fantastic time at Friends of the Earth. But then in 2019, I was approached about the job as chief exec at the Wildlife Trust. And at first, I wasn't planning to leave Friends of the Earth. I was really happy doing that for a while. But after a week, I first got the phone call. I found I just couldn't stop thinking about it. Sort of every moment, I was thinking about this job at the Wildlife Trust. And for three reasons. One is because I was really kind of frustrated how people, even in the environment community, treated nature as one issue and climate as a separate issue. You know? And yet they're inextricably linked. We all know that. We have no hope of solving the climate crisis unless we can put nature in recovery. Something we don't point out routinely enough is that climate change has been caused by burning fossil fuels. What are fossil fuels? They're dead biodiversity. You know? We've got to put nature in recovery if we're going to have any hope of reversing the climate crisis, as well as stopping burning fossil fuels as well. And similarly, the science is really clear now. Climate change does represent the biggest threat to nature in the decades ahead, particularly if we can turn around some of the other threats, which we hopefully might be able to do. So we've got to be able to solve and address the climate crisis as well. So I was very excited that the Wildlife Trust was a place where I'd be able to do that. I was also incredibly passionate and excited about the structure of the Wildlife Trust, because I've long believed that the bolder the ambitions you have about the change you need in society, the more you have to be rooted in local communities. You know, there are no solutions to environmental problems that can be done to people. The only ones that last and endure are those that are done by people, and particularly by communities, and I would say by diverse communities of people as well in doing that. And the Wildlife Trust, now structure of 46 independently autonomous local trusts but working together in a wider movement, I think is a really powerful structure for big change. And then the third point is our scale. And it's blown my mind since I've been at Wildlife Trust just how significant we are. And this is important for a couple of things I'm going to say later. You know, collectively, the 46 Wildlife Trusts have more wildlife nature reserves in the UK than McDonald's has got restaurants. In fact, 1,000 more. We estimate that 60% of the British population live within 3 miles of one of our nature reserves. Collectively, we're the 6th largest landowner in the UK. We have 3,000 staff, 50,000 volunteers, 870,000 supporters collectively. Last year, our combined turnover was almost 200 million. And actually, we have more school children go through our education programmes than any other British charity. And yet, we still sometimes think ourselves as small. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment and just figure out lessons for the future. We've just adopted a whole new strategy for the Wildlife Trusts, not one for each individual trust, but what we're trying to do together. What does it all add up to? 3 big goals in it. 1, to get nature in recovery and restoring the abundance of nature by 2030. The second is get people taking action on climate and nature by 2030. We have a target of getting 1 in 4 of the British population doing that by 2030. And the third is to really make sure that nature is playing its full role in helping us address big problems in society by then. Climate change, of course, nature-based solutions, but also pollution control, helping people's physical and mental well-being, and many other things besides. So look at our website if you want to know more about that new strategy and how we're trying to change things for the better by 2030. But I was also asked today to offer some thoughts on ingredients for successful conservation and what I'd like to see happen in the future. And I'm going to mash those together now and give you some 5 headings just to think about. And in doing all this, I'm going to make some sweeping generalisations, which all of you, myself included, will be able to find examples that completely disprove everything I'm saying. But I think I'm right, and I'm hoping that perhaps many of you will at the end of this. We'll just see, and I'd love to know what you think. The first one to kick off with, I don't like the word conservation. I think it's a rubbish word for what we're trying to do. You know, it's about conserving things. At least this is how the public would understand it. It's about keeping things as they are. That's how most people consider it to be. But if we live in one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, why do we want to keep it as it is? We don't. Of course we don't. We want to put nature in recovery at scale and at pace. And yet the word conservation, I think, holds us back. I think it keeps us thinking small. I think it keeps us thinking we've got to keep things as they are. I would say we're not so much conservationists as innovators and disruptors. That's what we certainly need to be. And I know as professional conservationists, we understand conservation can mean those things we were just talking about. It's fine. But outside this room, most people hear the word conservation and they think it's about keeping things as it is. And I don't think it helps us. And I think certainly the conservation movement at times over the last 100 or so years has had a mindset that's about trying to keep things as they are and just protect what we've got left, and maybe do a bit more than that. But I don't think we've done enough of actually what we have to do, which is be big and bold about putting nature in recovery. So maybe we want to think about that. The second point I want to share with you, science and evidence is not enough. I wish it were. If it were, we wouldn't have half the problems that we've got in the world. But it's not enough. Of course we've got to have the science and evidence on our side. Of course we've got to do the scientific work, we've got to do the data, the monitoring and so on to win our cases. We've got to do that. But too often, I find in my experience, there's too many of us in this wider sector think that's the job done. It's not. It's actually only the beginning. It's laying a foundation for the work that then needs to happen. We absolutely then have to think, so what? What do we do about that? How do we bring about change? And that means all kinds of thinking around power in society and influence and communications and engaging people and mobilising people and empowering people to take action and reaching out to others and all of those kind of things, which historically I don't think we think enough about in this wider sector. So I'd encourage us to think about that. Because if we only think, and I think broadly over 100 years, broadly this sector has put a bit too much focus on balance, on the science and evidence, slightly controversial thing to say, but not enough on how we bring about change with it. And I see too many conservationists sort of monitoring the decline in nature, but not enough being done about it. So I'll give you some thoughts to think about that. My third point, which is linked to that, power and influence. We need to think a lot more about power and influence and how does change happen in society. You know, if what we think our purpose is to try and address the climate and ecological crisis, then actually that has to be about shaping power and influence. And here's the thing, using our power and influence to bring that about. I said before, too often we think of ourselves as small. We do. As a sector, we need to think ourselves stronger. Do you know there's scientific evidence that you can think yourself more fit? This sounds ridiculous. But there's scientific evidence, and there's a good thing on BBC Sounds right now with Mike Mosley, that if you think if you imagine every day yourself doing press-ups, actually, that can make a difference to your muscles. It sounds absolutely ludicrous. But apparently there's scientific evidence to support that. Now, I didn't do enough thinking about press-ups, or indeed real press-ups, but it is worth thinking about that perhaps as a sector we need to think of ourselves stronger. You know, I said before, the Wildlife Trust has 870,000 members. That's twice the size of the Labour Party, that's 4 times the size of the Conservative Party. RSPB has 2 million members. National Trust is approaching 7 million. You know, we're huge. We're not small, we're huge. And we need to think about that a little bit more. And I think what's important in that is as we build up our power and influence, and particularly, this is where I think the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda is really important, because if we make ourselves as inclusive as possible as a sector, we will also be more powerful, so apart from the fact that it's the right thing to do in its own right, then we can bring about the changes we need. The fourth point is we have to make sure we're telling the truth. And again, over the last 27 years, I find too often in the conservation community we're a bit scared sometimes to tell the truth. You know, I've often had the phrase said to me over 27 years, if a particular organisation is being bold in what it's saying, it's often it's labelled as being political. It's a political organisation because it's telling the truth. But you know, to tell the truth, I would suggest to you, is not political. It's actually when you decide to edit what you want to say, or to hold back the truth because you're worried about offending someone. That's the moment you're being political. And I think broadly, again, sweeping generalisation, I think perhaps the conservation sector has sometimes been a bit shy to really tell the truth. We're too apologetic at times, and too often we're happy to accept the crumbs on the table rather than actually what's needed to bring about change. And I know Martin will agree with me, absolutely. So my fifth is about ambition. I don't think we've been ambitious enough. Simple as that, really. You know, what we're facing, it builds up from all the other things I said. What we're facing is nothing less than this ecological crisis. And to go back to what I was saying before, is this a question of conservation, or is it a question about restoring nature and restoring ecosystem processes at pace and at scale? So yes, it's exciting now that we're starting to talk about trying to get a target of 30% of our land and sea into recovery for nature by 2030. But you know, actually the science is saying probably we need to get to around 50% by 2050. So we've got to start saying that. And I know that sounds a bit ambitious and a bit mad to some people, but what's the point of doing the other stuff if it doesn't actually deliver on the purpose we need? Because, you know, this is not just actually about nature. This is not just about nature conservation. This is a negotiation between us and the whole of humanity about the future and about actually the next step of human progress, I would say. Because I would say there is no step of human progress. The next step of human progress has to be, surely, us living fairly within environmental limits, and that includes with flourishing and abundant nature. A wilder future where we have nature all around us, part of our lives, where we've rebuilt the connection between people and nature, and that nature is properly flourishing and delivering those ecosystem services. And the interesting thing is the science is pretty clear, isn't it? That if we don't do that, there might not be another step of human progress. I'm actually defy anyone to say what it is if we don't do that. So I said we're in that negotiation with the rest of humanity. In negotiations, you have to strike high, not low. So I think we've got to be a lot more ambitious in what we're asking for as a sector, in what we believe can be done, in what is possible. And if we in a sector can use our science and evidence, if we can use our power and influence, if we can use our skills as innovators and disruptors, then we might just be able to make it happen. Thank you very much.
I'm going to be talking about my experience on the Masters and about my work. So I started my Masters in 2019. I'm actually still doing it. So I'm a part-time student and I started my studies for the year So it's a very good thing in my life, and I'm really delighted to have the Masters in conservation as part of my life for 3 years, and I'll miss it hugely when it actually does come to an end. I will talk a bit about my work before my Masters, because I'm doing it for mid-career, and I worked before in humanitarian response and international development. I started very beginning in Nigeria. Moved to Congo Brazil. I lived in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and more recently in India and Bangladesh. So I worked for various NGOs, CRS for a lot of times, and did a lot of emergency work, but also programs in agriculture, livelihoods, health, health professionals. We always work with local organisations and partner organisations. Water and sanitation programs. It felt like dip into a bit of anything, which is the joy of working in that line of work. But I think one thing I almost never touched on was biodiversity conservation, and just coming back to the UK and really engaging in those debates that was like a bit of a wake-up call, and I wanted to learn much more about it. And as I do my master's and reflect on my earlier work, I think the challenge is to try and bring those two things together a bit, and to do international development, humanitarian response, and some sort of environmental recovery or nature restoration at the same time. That I see as a real challenge. My work during my master's, particularly during lockdown, has been for Forest Trends. I'm still working for them. I did a big research project for about a year, and about a year ago this report was published, Illicit Harvest and Complicit Goods. I co-authored with Art Blundell. We asked 3 research questions. How much deforestation in the tropics was for commercial agriculture? How much was illegal? And how much was exported? And our findings, the methodology was all to do through literature review. It was desk review, a lot of data crunching, looking at forest loss and trade data and FAO data. And the finding was that 60% of deforestation in the tropics was due to commercial agriculture. So taking aside subsistence agriculture, because we don't want that to be in the firing line for stopping deforestation. And at least 69% of that is illegal, likely illegal. It's very hard to pin down exactly how much tropical deforestation is illegal, but I was doing a review of each country's legal frameworks and pulling together all the studies that had been done of how much tropical deforestation is illegal. And of that, we established that 31% is exported. So this is, in terms of kind of the global spread of this problem, the size of the circle is the size of forest loss. The biggest areas of tropical forests are in Brazil, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Indonesia, and they have the greatest forest loss. The coloured circle is how much is due to commercial agriculture, so Africa is really the exception in it not being really exclusively driven by commercial agriculture. And the colour shows the likely illegality. So in Brazil, it is well documented that almost all, 99%, of agroconversion, so forest being transformed into commercial agriculture, is likely illegal. Indonesia is very likely the same, but there's poorer data available. Some audits have been conducted of the palm oil sector. And so this was feeding into draft legislation in the UK and in the US, a bit also in the EU, which is probably leading the field in terms of its due diligence legislation for zero deforestation. And it was interesting to work with colleagues at Forest Trends. A colleague is a Chatham House Fellow and embedded in DEFRA, working on this legislation. So very close work between the research and the policy advisory roles that Forest Trends has. And the UK Environment Act 2022, Article 17, is on prohibiting commodities, the import of commodities that have come from illegally deforested land. So there's a real opportunity there to try and put the brakes on some of this deforestation that is happening in the tropics. What I would like to see, though, is a far stronger law, and based on the research into how much is illegal, it's very, very hard to pin down what is illegal. So requiring companies to do due diligence to prove their supply chain is free of illegal deforestation, there's a lot of wiggle room there. So I admire the EU's approach of saying zero deforestation in supply chains. Also, previous speakers have talked about the kind of silos that exist, and there's a real silo between the environment and human rights, and the two really need to go together. So in defining what is illegal, the UK is saying it's going to
be defined by local laws and land use, land zoning laws, not taking into account human rights abuses or slavery or other aspects of illegality. So there's room there to really toughen it up. It is also only local law. So if the country hasn't adopted as national law their international commitments regarding indigenous peoples and local community ownership of forest, there is simply not relevant in terms of this UK prohibition on commodities. Likewise, it could be tighter in terms of which commodities are included by making it specific, for example, to soy, maize that's intercropped with that soy that could be on former forest that's been illegally deforested is not under this proposed law within the UK. So these are a lot of areas where I think there could be room for improvement in the future. And in terms of thinking more broadly about forest conservation and tropical forests, I chose this picture to speak to. This is a photo I saw at an exhibition at Somerset House a few weeks ago. It's by photographer Pablo Albarega, and it's called Nantu, and Nantu is this gentleman's name. He is from the Achua indigenous territory in Ecuador. And I chose it because, for me, I think the main message I've learned from doing my modules here, my studies, and combining that with my work, my previous work and my current work in forest policy, is that the indigenous peoples and the local communities have to be at the centre of environmental policies and of forest conservation. And it touches on that idea of bringing together environmental rights and human rights. Those two have to be treated together. And it follows through with joined up funding and planning for development and environmental projects. So often those two are treated separately, are funded separately, and can be detrimental to each other. Too many conservation projects block people out and refuse access to natural resources for the poorest people and for the people who have a right to, a customary right to that land. And likewise, too many development projects bring in either large-scale corporates or practices which are detrimental to the environment. So there needs to be a really big change and move towards joined-up development and environmental funding and planning. I would say that change needs to kind of happen at the top with financing. The World Bank, the UNDP, it would be great to have an alumni from the Masters Conservation Programme heading up the World Bank and just seeing international financing in a different way and putting the environment at the forefront of all development funding. Political will is key. The kind of weaknesses identified in the Environment Act follow through to this kind of view of corporates and kind of the predominance of profit and corporate power and kind of weakening of regulations. So really important to have that political will to stand up to corruption, to poverty, and to environmental degradation. I think the new work being done around the ecocide, definition of ecocide as a crime is really interesting, and it'll be hopefully really positive to see where that goes and see hopefully that it could be adopted by the International Criminal Court and the Rome Statute, and also by national governments as laws. But I think, again, people need to be at the centre. Who's going to be taking cases to court when it's the environment that is the injured party? You need people to be empowered. You need the indigenous peoples, the local communities to have formalised land tenure and to be empowered to fight for their rights in the courts of law. The same goes for financing. The carbon markets are an opportunity but very problematic. Working for Forest Trends, I work for an organisation that believes that markets are the solution, and I find myself constantly having tricky discussions where I try to put limitations around that and argue for stronger regulations. But I think mechanisms like REDD+, funding emissions reductions for forest conservation are a huge opportunity, but they haven't got a great track record, and they have continued this pattern of disempowering the local communities. The money goes to the governments or to the international organisations. It's very hard to really see the benefits tied both to conservation results and to local communities and Indigenous peoples. And finally, the push for protected areas, the push for creating new protected areas, increasing the amount of land under protected areas. Yes, but, at risk of sounding like a broken record, put those rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities into the framework for those protected areas, because excluding them sets up conflict and entrenches poverty, and working with the local communities is adding huge potential for partnership and for collaboration and on the ground expertise in conservation where it matters. So this image of Nantu is the one I'm closing with, and a little bit more about him. He is lying on 2 palm branches, which are what he harvests from the forest to thatch his roof. And the aerial view of the forest that is on the right of the picture is the forest he's working to conserve in Ecuador. He runs a solar-powered boat company, which is trying to shift people off fossil fuels within his local community. And I think he's a real inspiration to us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cassie. That was fantastic and great to hear about how your experience in the humanitarian sector crosses over so heavily with work in more remote regions, and how land rights should be really brought to the forefront and Indigenous peoples and their knowledge acknowledged and brought into the picture of biodiversity conservation. Next we have a video from Nelani La Cruz, who is with the Guyana Wildlife Conservation and Management Commission. And yeah, so Jan's going to play.
It's obviously being remotely presented because she couldn't join us here, so she sent me the file with a voiceover. So let's hope it runs all right. Bear with me.
Hello everyone, my name is Nelani Cruz, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity today to share my experience in aquatic and terrestrial conservation. I'm from Octopus, a small community in Guyana, and prior to pursuing a master's in aquatic science, I acquired a bachelor's science degree in environmental studies from the University of Guyana. I consider Dr. Leon Alonso and Dr. Carl Sayer role models. My interest in aquatic conservation originated because there were many water-related issues in my community. So much so that the quality of water consumed in Matthews Ridge became the focus of my undergraduate thesis. The gentleman in this photograph is trying to collect water from 2 locations potable water was sourced in my community back in 2014. My interest in aquatic conservation, together with my willingness to volunteer whenever called upon, led to me being selected to work with local and international researchers who conducted biodiversity assessments in multiple regions in Guyana. On these assessments, this was the first assessment, I worked on a water quality team, and on the second assessment, the pension work, and the assessment in the Northeast region, I worked on a team studying water results. So I was really keen on pursuing postgraduate studies in aquatic ecology and aquatic conservation. So coming to UCL was really a dream, and that year surpassed all expectations. Upon my return to Guyana, I was employed as a research officer at the Guyana Wildlife Conservation and Management Commission. Now, having been sponsored for 1 year by the government of Guyana while I was completing the MSc, I was contractually obligated to serve my country for 3 years. At the commission, I conducted research on species of high conservation priority, I developed protocols and methodologies to survey priority species. I worked with local and international researchers to promote human-wildlife coexistence, among other things. Now, I was a bit disappointed that the focus of my job was not aquatic conservation, but I was really keen to use the knowledge, the experiences, and the skill sets I had just acquired to influence the agency's work program, and I did so by investigating threats to Guyana's wildlife, inclusive of those posed by invasive alien species, advocated for the assessment of aquatic ecosystems as part of species surveys, excuse me, and promoted the importance of a landscape conservation approach in the execution of the Commission's work program, facilitated stakeholder engagements in indigenous communities, hinterland villages, and other areas where human and wildlife interactions occur, and advocated for the inclusion of coastal marine species in the Commission's work program. So interacting with wild animals was a really cool part of the job. This involved training in how to safely handle animals, as can be observed from the picture on the left, where I was photographed holding a juvenile caiman. In the photo in the center, I was feeding a tropical otter that was rescued. And in the picture on the right, I was feeding a baby parakeet, which was also rescued. All really, 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 really interesting, great fun. Now, an important component of my job was conducting research to understand human-wildlife interactions and, the major catalysts for conflict, human-wildlife conflicts in the area. I worked with Dr. Anthony Cummings in this regard. He had been interested in these interactions for many years and had just acquired a grant from National Geographic to fund his research. And I essentially was the person selected to work with him from the Wildlife Commission. Through this study, I was able to visit 21 communities in Guyana to understand human-wildlife interactions. I facilitated a workshop in those communities. I provided training on how to respond to human-wildlife interactions, developed educational materials to reduce human-wildlife conflict, and contributed to the development of a toolkit to reduce conflict. Now, the major outcomes from that study, I would say, was the development of a toolkit for the resolution of human-wildlife conflict, as well as a story map I developed that depicted conflict across Guyana and provided really useful information to anybody who was interested in this on the, can be easily accessed on the internet. Now, due to budgetary constraints and other reasons, many of my efforts to conduct further work to aid conservation of wildcats was not possible. So, on a few occasions, I used my resources, relationships, and networks to organize activities geared towards conservation of wildcats. In the photograph here, my sister and I, we're having an activity with some children in Matthews Bridge. Now, prior to this point, so this photograph was taken in December 2019. Prior to that point, we had at the commission we received a lot of reports of the increased presence of wildcats, and there were attacks on specifically dogs in the community, and the persons were really afraid. This is the first time they would have seen attacks of this nature in maybe close to 20 years. And, understandably, they were afraid for their own safety and for the safety of the children. The power company in the community, they were experiencing some trouble, and, many parts of the community, they were without electricity for a very long time. So that, together with some other reasons, really, I think that was the major catalyst for the increased activity by the cats and persons losing their pets and fear. In my capacity as a research officer, because of financial constraints, I was not able to come to the community to do any type of work. And so on my Christmas break, a little, well, would have been 6 months after the initial reports started, I was able to return to Masters Ridge and to conduct this really interesting activity. So we had children, teachers, and some parents come out. We made it as attractive as possible because it was Christmas season, and so bringing them out from their home, all the Christmas festivities was important for us, and we're able to do so. So that was something I was really proud of. The following year, during the pandemic, I still wanted to do something. There was a lot we couldn't do for obvious reasons, but I managed to organize a webinar in collaboration with WWF Guyana's and the Women in Nature Network. So that was a webinar that, again, it raised, we raised awareness of the importance of conserving jaguars, to share a little bit of what was happening in the country and essentially why conserving jaguars is important in Guyana. So, yeah, I was, again, really, really happy that we were able to pull that off. Now, last March of 2021, I decided to leave the commission. I fulfilled my obligations to the government and wanted to focus my attention on other things that I was passionate about. And so leaving was a bit hard because the work there is really important. And I liked knowing that I was contributing to something that was that important. There's this song called The Hymn for Guyana's Children. There's a line there that always gets me. It says, "And bless the land that gave you birth, and vow to serve her through the years." And I really cannot think of a better way for me to have served my country. Of my contribution to the commission, I'm particularly proud of work I did to aid jaguar conservation, the work I did to aid sea turtle conservation, and tapir conservation, my contributions towards the camelotology, the work I did in communities, and of course, the work I did caring for animals. From the period of 2018 to 2021, I kept my passion for aquatic conservation alive through my affiliation with the Faculty of Environmental Science at the University of Guyana. So I essentially taught. I was a lecturer there. I lectured the courses Wetland Environment in 2018 and Aquatic Science in 2020. And I also served as supervisor and assessor for undergraduate students conducting research associated with aquatic systems, which was really good as well. It kept me busy, and as I mentioned, kept that passion for aquatic conservation alive. All right, so after I left the commission, I had a few opportunities to work as an environmental consultant. The most recent opportunity was geared towards conserving the Northwest Atlantic sea turtle. And it was a really great experience for me. I'd done some work at the commission to raise awareness on sea turtles. I did some research to understand what was happening with sea turtles. And so when the opportunity came for me to essentially be hired as a lead consultant for this project, I was really happy. I submitted my proposal, I was successful, and through that entire process, I was able to visit many of the beaches. I was able to engage with fishermen and other persons in the community to really understand what's happening with these sea turtles in Guyana. In the region, we've noticed a decline for a very long time, but it was good to understand what was happening and that led to the creation of reports and recommendations on what the priorities at the national level were, for us to conserve the Northwest Atlantic leadback sea turtle subpopulation in Guyana. So it's all part of the creation of a regional action plan for the leadbacks, and every country, the countries in the region, so Suriname, French Guiana, Guyana, as well as Trinidad and Tobago. Those countries in particular needed to identify national priorities. It was an amazing experience. I really enjoyed it. In the future, it is my desire to conduct research in freshwater ecosystems. I've done a lot of work. I'd say I've done a lot of work to understand some of the things happening, but there is, of course, a whole lot more that is necessary. There's so many aquatic systems, all very beautiful. Well, most of them, some of them, unfortunately. But it is my desire to do some work in freshwater ecosystem. And I think I would like to, maybe the very top of the list is getting a better understanding of what's happening with Phylloxera in the country. I visited Phylloxera Guru in 2019, in September of 2019. Dr. Megan Duffy, rain started again. Dr. Megan Duffy at the University of Michigan. We had a really nice meeting and really good chat. That's me standing outside of her office. And you see the Phylloxera there in the background. And I've already selected a few lakes that I think would be suitable for this research. And so now that I have a little bit more free time in my hand and really trying to get a sense of what I will be doing next, I, as I mentioned, really want to do some work on Phylloxera. All right, thank you so much. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Right, and just to specify, I hope Melanie will be able to join us later on for the discussion round. So we'll postpone questions until then.
That's great. That was really, really great to hear from an international student who's been able to take the skills they've learned from this degree back to their home country. Next we have Sophie Bembo from Fauna and Flora International.
Everybody gets it the wrong way around. Lovely. Thank you very much. Great. I hope everyone's coffee is still powering through. So my name is Sophie Bembo. I'm currently the head of marine at Fauna and Flora International. We are a very large international biodiversity conservation organisation. But obviously, do I need to point it here? There we go. So I did the Conservation Masters back in 2005, as far as I can remember. And I've always been passionate about the ocean, so I'm always happy to talk about that. And so I found a way to feature the marine stuff in the Masters by developing a dissertation looking at cetacean distribution abundance around the Moray Firth. And that for me was really the catalyst of figuring out where I want to go next. So having done the Masters, I applied for an internship with an organisation called Blue Ventures. So at that time, they were a relatively small marine conservation-focused organisation, only working in Madagascar. So I interned in the London office and was very fortunate that after a couple of months, I ended up in Madagascar, a really wonderful place to be. Not great roads to get there, but a really fantastic place to spend quite a few years. Pretty much from my side, living the dream, living in a hut on the beach, diving every day, training volunteers, and really embracing and being part of those communities. And I also kind of fell in love with the humble octopus. So Blue Ventures have done a lot of work on sustainable management of octopus fisheries. They're really well adapted to short-term fisheries closures, and that's the whole premise of the success and the kind of spread of conservation in southwest Madagascar. So it's a really simple fishery. Anybody can do it. They simply walk out on the reef flat at low tide and find the octopus hidden there. That's the collection truck, so that's how the octopus is exported. An octopus that this lady catches that's transported in this truck ends up in supermarkets in Spain. So it's one of those kind of global supply chains that is so important to the communities in Madagascar. And with some relatively simple conservation management measures, we can increase the productivity for the local fishers, we can increase the value, the money that they're receiving from that fishery, and we can ensure that the whole system remains sustainable. This is one of the opening days, so these short-term 2 to 3 month closures, and then on the opening day the fishers go out, they have a massive boom, they catch a couple of tons of octopus in a single day using spears. It's quite a phenomenal experience to see. And then there's obviously a lot of data collection and science going along with that, so I was able to publish a few papers that document how successful these closures are and how the sustainability of the fisheries has now catalysed broader conservation, so there's now permanent closures that the communities are fully bought into. So it's been a really nice catalyst to engage communities and then result in stronger, longer-term conservation measures. I just put this in, so this was Cyclone Funzo, which was back in 2015, just as an example of also how vulnerable these communities are. And a couple of speakers have mentioned it already, but just the need to engage on conservation issues holistically and consider that these people are so incredibly vulnerable to the impact of these storm events, and they are happening more and more often. When I first went to Madagascar, they hadn't had a storm in a very long time, and by the time I left, we'd had 2 or 3 large storms. The riverbanks in the city that I was living in had breached and half the town had flooded, so it was really obvious that climate for these communities is something that needs to be considered more holistically as we engage on conservation, development, and any other kind of introduced measures. So after 5 years in Madagascar, I moved to FFI, Fauna and Flora International, based in Cambridge. Bit of a culture shock after a long time, by the coast of Madagascar to a small city, but a really fantastic organisation. I was very fortunate, so I entered on a maternity cover role, which I think is quite a top tip for people trying to break into conservation. It's obviously not a reliable long-term role, but if the organisation likes you and you perform well, quite often it evolves into a longer-term opportunity, and that was what happened for me. So I started off managing the Asia-Pacific programme, engaging in Myanmar, Cambodia, Indonesia, supporting some dive training of local these are actually government staff and FFI staff in Myanmar, so helping to empower and engender and just integrate conservation into everything that's going on in those communities. Just a little bit about FFI in general, because I don't know how familiar people are with the work of FFI, and in particular that we have quite a well-established marine programme. So we have 3 key aims. We want to secure effective site-based protection, so marine protected areas under whichever name or acronym is appropriate to the local context, starting with community-based closures, but also engaging with government on top-down closures, where there's a need and a niche that we can add value to. We also seek to improve policy and practice, so recognising that in order for MPAs to be effectively managed, there needs to be the right legislation, the right regulations in place, and it needs to be enforceable. But also then letting us tackle some of the broader, more holistic threats to ocean health, so marine plastic pollution, oil and gas extraction, deep sea mining, destructive fishing, and also thinking about a focus on sustainability, so trying to build in, I've just noticed the slides are up there as well, that's handy. So building in sustainable financing mechanisms into some of the conservation work, and I think a couple of other speakers have also mentioned it, that as you do a master's in conservation, but you have to be more than that. You have to be an economist, you have to be a political strategist, you have to be a small business development manager in order that all of those things can progress. And then thirdly, FFI has a really strong focus on capacity building. So we don't go into a country and seek to set up our own country programme. We would always look to identify an appropriate local partner. So if it's a smaller NGO, a national NGO, it could be a fishing cooperative, it could be an academic institution, a local government partner, an MPA manager, whatever the need is, whoever is the most appropriate local actor. And then we can do some capacity needs assessments with them to understand what they need to be better placed to deliver marine conservation over the longer term. So we're currently active across 17 countries around the world, and in my role as head of marine, that's what I do. So I have general oversight of the global marine portfolio. supporting our teams on the ground and in Cambridge to deliver conservation in the most effective way through our partners and our staff. Just to press the MPA point and kind of link into some of the global targets. So back in around 2005, collectively the world decided to aim for 10% protection by 2012. We still haven't reached it. We're only at 7% and only less than 3% of that is fully protected. Obviously there's big arguments and debates around protection, but there is generally still a very long way to go. So then the other thing that I was asked to do for this talk was to think about some reasons for conservation success and some kind of learning from what I've done so far in my career. So I've got 3 that I wanted to just flag to you guys. The first one, that it needs to be embedded in local action. So you need to engage communities, you need them to be supportive, you need to consult them, you need to be there on the ground. And that's FFI's approach, that we would look for a local partner that can do that. So rather than being the kind of parachute conservationist coming in, doing your bit and leaving, you can empower and build the capacity and the structure of the local organisations that can then take it forward. And then innovation. So I think the first speaker was talking about tech and AI and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. In terms of the MPA patrols and enforcement, I think that's a route that's going to have to be gone down, particularly as we start talking about more high seas protection. There's no way to enforce and patrol those without some kind of satellite tech, AI systems to ensure that we can then support governments to actually enforce those areas rather than being paper parks. And the other thing I just wanted to flag on innovation was linking back to sustainable financing. So obviously blue carbon is becoming very trendy in the world. There's lots of people talking about it, from seagrass, mangroves, salt marsh, all the other kind of critical coastal ecosystems. Also thinking about tourism levies and sustainable financing mechanisms that can be generated like that. Obviously COVID was not productive with that moving forward in the last 2 years, but it is a route that a lot of projects do look to. And then this picture on the right is a pufferfish from Turkey, a frozen pufferfish from the lab. So this is an invasive species from the Red Sea. It's come through the Suez Canal, and as the temperature in the Eastern Mediterranean is heating up, it's now effectively evolving into a mini Red Sea. So these are a carnivorous predatory fish. There's no other predators for it in the Eastern Med, so they're just absolutely booming. They're incredibly toxic, and there's a company in North America that is looking to harness and process that toxin as a pain-relieving drug. So there's a potential really innovative, creative mechanism for sustainable financing there, if you can find a way to create a market for this fish and then get the profits going back into conservation. And then my final one around taking restorative measures. So whenever you're thinking about conservation, whenever you're engaging in a site, just make sure that what you're doing, protection is fantastic. Obviously, you protect what's there because that's the most biodiverse thing. But when you're moving forward and trying to create solutions, make sure it's with a restorative mindset on, particularly thinking about things like aquaculture. So the global shift towards aquaculture as a solution. I have reservations around that, but I won't go into them. But if we can focus on the lower trophic level species, think about mussels and oysters and things like that, then there's broader biodiversity benefits that can come from that. And looking to the future, this is the island of Principe, Santa Maria and Principe in the Gulf of Guinea. Really wonderful kind of Jurassic Park landscape. So I think my take home, and I think a few people have also mentioned it, is the need to be collaborative. We need to engage holistically on all these conservation challenges. The world is at risk and we cannot solve it in silos. We need to come together and we need to think and create collective solutions. And then the little Word document there was just to frame it as a policy thing, that there are several key marine-focused policy opportunities coming up this year. 2022 has been billed the Ocean Super Year, delayed from 2020 for the pandemic. So there are a number of key moments happening. So there was the UN Environment Assembly in March that committed to the Global Plastics Treaty. There's UN Oceans Conference in June, which is trying to bring together science and policymakers. There is the subsidy debate at the World Trade Organization to finally hopefully remove or reduce harmful fishing subsidies, which could potentially drastically change the whole fishing industry. The BBNJ debate, so the areas beyond national jurisdiction, and the High Seas Treaty, so we manage much more of our ocean space. The ISA is the International Seabed Authority, so they have the mandate to grant licenses for deep sea mining, which is incredibly worrying. And then the last one is the climate COP, so COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. So obviously the Glasgow COP got a lot of press coverage. It was really well publicised, and marine and ocean has gradually got a little bit of a shout out, but I think there's a lot more scope to really show the power of the ocean in solving some of the climate crisis. And that's it, I think. There we go.
That's wonderful, Sophie. Thank you. Really interesting to hear how a large organisation like FFI can have grassroots and capacity building in countries around the world. So yeah, that was very interesting indeed. I'd just like to remind everyone that we will have a panel discussion at the end of today's sessions. So if you have any questions that you're thinking of for any of our speakers, do take a note of them, and you'll get an opportunity to quiz people later. Just before we go to a quick break, we've got a handful of short 2 to 3 minute videos from some other alumni that we'd like to screen for you now. And so yeah, it should be about 10-12 minutes, and then we can go for another tea and coffee break and mingling.
My name is Olivia Rockwell. I completed my master's in conservation in 2010. After graduating, I worked at the Zoological Society of London, supporting and overseeing their conservation technology program. I began my work as an intern, but I was able to focus my career at ZSL on the development and use of new tools and technology and data management systems for remote monitoring and protected area management. This role ended up being critical for my next move, which was to Aotearoa, New Zealand. I moved to New Zealand in 2015 and quickly learned that a major aspect of New Zealand's conservation sector is a focus on eradication. This is because New Zealand is experiencing a biodiversity crisis, as it has the highest rate of threatened indigenous species in the world. In 2016, the New Zealand government launched the Predator-Free 2050 effort. The Predator-Free 2050 vision is focused on the complete removal of 5 most damaging predators: rats, stoats, parrots, weasels, and possums by the year 2050. My current position is with Predator-Free 2050 Limited, which is a Crown-owned charitable company established to help deliver the New Zealand government's ambitious goal. The company provides co-funding to enable predator control and eradication projects at large landscape scale, and the breakthrough science needed to underpin them. My role is to manage and support projects we fund under our science strategy. This includes funding projects that will fast-track research, development, and production of new predator control and eradication tools and technologies. Some of these tools include things like highly sensitive detection camera to detect and identify possum, rats, and stoats, to help protect some of the most remote predator-free landscapes in New Zealand. Low-cost, open-source automated system for dispensing lures to rodents and possums, which is designed to last up to a year, drastically reducing the labor cost involved in rebaiting. New toxins like rat-selective toxin novenite that lack toxicity to birds and other mammals. And other tools include sulfur-7 traps and traps designed for the last few hard-to-catch predators that may remain in an area after control operations. We also fund integral research on Hamalsharan Maori indigenous knowledge, coupled with the latest innovations in technology, is key to best practice.